The envelope sat on my counter like it owned the place, buttercream yellow, propped against the register, waiting for me before the sun even thought about rising. I recognized the handwriting immediately, and it wasn't the handwriting I'd grown up trusting. It belonged to the woman who signed away custody of me when I was small enough to still believe love was unconditional. 23 years of silence, and now she wanted something. I told myself one wire transfer would end it. $45,000 and my signature, and she'd vanish again. I was wrong. What she really wanted wouldn't fit inside a bank statement, and by the time I understood that, she'd already made herself comfortable in my parents' living room. If you're new here, welcome to Quiet Reckonings, where we tell the stories of women who finally figured out where the exit was and weren't afraid to use it. If this one hits close to home, stay till the end, and don't forget to subscribe. I didn't open the envelope right away. First I lit the ovens, because that's the ritual, flour and yeast, and the hush of a kitchen before the world wakes up. My shop is called Marigold's on the corner of Ash and Founders, and I own every brick of it outright. A fact I still say out loud sometimes just to hear how it sounds. My name is Elena Voss. I'm 32. My husband Theo restores old furniture 2 storefronts down, and most mornings he brings me a coffee before either of us has spoken, because he's learned that I don't exist yet until the first batch is in the oven. Our son Milo just turned 1. He has a laugh like a tiny broken hiccup, and holding him reminds me why I never went digging for a past I didn't need. The people who raised me, Margaret and Walt, sold me this bakery for one symbolic dollar and a promise to keep their old sourdough culture alive. They aren't my biological parents. They're simply the ones who never left. Margaret's heart has been acting up lately. Small irregular flutters her cardiologist is keeping an eye on, and Walt copes by rearranging flower displays he doesn't need to rearrange. I'd stayed late 3 nights straight that week finishing a wedding order, partly because the job demanded it, and partly because some stubborn part of me still believes that if I stay useful enough, nobody will ever have a reason to let me go again. I wiped my hands and looked at the envelope one more time. Wrong name on the return address, right color to make my stomach drop. I told myself I'd deal with it after the wedding cake was done. I didn't. Here's the truth about my biological parents. I know almost nothing, and somehow I built an entire identity around that nothing. I was barely 3 when the paperwork was finalized, old enough to keep one fragmented memory, hands buttoning my coat too fast, a car door slamming, cold vinyl seats. Margaret told me the real story when I was 10, because she believed secrets poison a household slower than truth ever could. She said my birth parents wanted a son and could only afford to raise one child properly, so they made their choice. She didn't cushion it. She just held my hand while I did math no 10-year-old should have to do. At 11, a stranger called our house once, asked for a name I didn't recognize, then never called again. I found Margaret crying quietly in the pantry that same night, thinking I hadn't noticed. That was the entire relationship for over 2 decades, one rushed coat buttoning and one phantom phone call. I used to lie awake as a kid imagining my birth mother crying somewhere too, missing me. Eventually I stopped imagining because hope like that is a bill you pay with your own peace, installment by installment. So I baked instead. Dough doesn't care whether you are wanted. Dough only asks for warmth, patience, and attention, 3 things I had in abundance. Eventually people were driving in from neighboring towns for my croissants. I built a family that chose me on purpose. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, an envelope the color of wedding icing appeared on my counter, and that button coat feeling came roaring back like it had never actually left. I finally opened it after the morning rush, in the back room where the mixer drowns out anything you don't want to feel too loudly. The paper was heavy, the kind people buy when they want a letter to feel important. Her handwriting looped and curved, careful, performative, the penmanship of someone who wants to look gentle on paper. My darling Lila, it began, and my stomach fell through the floor, because nobody had ever called me Lila. That name belonged to a birth certificate I'd never even held. She wrote that she thought of me constantly. That fate had returned me to her heart. And then, 3 paragraphs deep, wrapped in so much syrup I nearly missed the blade underneath, she asked for $45,000. Not for herself, she clarified, but for my half-brother. His name was Julian. 19 years old, full of potential, and college, she reminded me, had gotten so expensive. She underlined the word family twice. She signed the letter, your mother, Renata, as if that word were simply true, rather than something a person has to earn through years of showing up. I sat down on an overturned bucket and read it twice. $45,000. From a woman who once decided I was the cheaper child to release. My hands stayed steady, and I noticed that steady hands in a moment like that usually means some part of you has already gone cold and calculating. She wanted money, that part was simple enough. But she'd signed it with a title she surrendered decades ago, and that told me the cash was only the entry point. She wasn't asking for help. She was informing me that the account she'd opened when I was 3 had, in her mind, never actually closed, and she'd come to make a withdrawal. My first instinct was a clean, immediate no. No guilt, no hesitation, arriving before shame could even get its shoes on. I'm not someone who bends because a stranger writes your mother at the bottom of a page. I called my friend Odette on my lunch break. She's a paralegal, and she tells me the truth even when it costs me dessert. I read her the letter standing in the alley behind the shop, apron still on, trash bins humming beside me. She went quiet, then delivered the sentence that should have set me completely free. Elena, once an adoption is finalized, the legal relationship is severed entirely. She is not your mother in any way the law recognizes. You owe her nothing, not money, not an explanation, not even a reply. I remember watching a delivery truck idle at the end of the alley, thinking, that's it then. Over. I could toss the letter into the dumpster 3 feet away, and no court on earth could argue with me. Legally, I was a total stranger to Renata Hill. Strangers don't get $45,000. But Odette knew me too well, and after a pause she added the line that undid the calm entirely. Legally, sure. But you and I both know that's not the account she thinks she's collecting on. I didn't answer because she was right, and because that particular account had no legal protections at all, only the soft, hopeful, 20-year-old wound in me that still occasionally wondered if a mother somewhere had cried over losing me. That part of me didn't care about legality. That part was already reaching for a pen. I wrote back that night at the kitchen table. Milo asleep upstairs, Theo pretending to read across from me. I kept it brief and civil, because civility was the only boundary I trusted myself to hold. I told her I was glad she and her son were well, that I had a full life already, and that I wouldn't be sending any money. I didn't sign it your daughter. I signed it Elena. Then I found the number scrawled at the bottom of her letter, meant for wiring instructions, and I blocked it. Theo watched the whole thing. He's not a man who tells me how to feel. He just laid his hand over mine on the table and said quietly, you don't owe that woman anything. If she comes at you, she comes at both of us. I believed him. I slept like the door had actually closed. I have to be honest about the part I'm not proud of, because you came here for honesty. Even while writing the refusal, some other voice in me was already running numbers. 45,000 was a lot, sure, but I owned a building outright. If one payment made the guilt evaporate, if one check let me be the generous one, the bigger person, maybe that was worth it just to feel done. I almost signed that check purely to buy silence. If you've ever paid for peace that never actually arrived, you already know exactly where this goes. Keep watching. I mailed the refusal anyway. The next afternoon, Margaret's phone rang. She called me at the shop, her voice carrying a thin, brittle thread I hadn't heard since her last hospital visit. A woman had phoned the house asking for someone named Lila. Walt told her there was no Lila at that address. The woman had replied, almost sweetly, oh, there is. She just goes by something else now, doesn't she? And how's that little bakery of hers doing? My grip tightened on the piping bag until the seam split. Renata had the landline, not my cell, which I'd already blocked, pulled from some old directory listing under a family name and a town. And she knew about the shop. I hadn't told her a single detail. I blocked her. And still she was reaching straight past me toward the people I would burn the whole building down to protect. I kept my voice level for Margaret's sake, told her not to worry, told her to hang up if it happened again. But after I set the phone down, something ugly and fast was moving through my chest. Because a stranger who accepts rejection walks away. A stranger who circles behind you to find the gentlest people in your orbit isn't asking anymore. She's testing the walls, hunting for whichever window got left unlocked. I called Theo. Then I did what I do when I'm frightened. I got organized. I made a list of everyone Renata might target next, and everyone I needed to warn. It was a short list. Every name on it was someone I loved. That was exactly the problem. That night I did some digging of my own, because I'd rather understand a threat's shape than be blindsided by it. It didn't take much effort. Renata hadn't just found a landline. She knew I'd had a baby. She'd mentioned Milo's age to Margaret in passing, the way you drop a fact just to prove you're holding more of them. She knew the bakery had expanded. She knew my married name. None of that had been publicly available the way it might have been years ago. Someone had been feeding her information. When I laid the timeline out on my kitchen table, what turned my stomach wasn't that she'd tracked me down. It was when her letter arrived 6 weeks after a regional paper had run a small feature on marigolds, complete with a photo of me grinning behind a 3-tier cake. 23 years of total silence, and the exact moment I looked financially solvent, a letter arrives calling me darling. I sat with that realization a long time, because it meant the silence had never actually been silence. It had been patience. She hadn't forgotten and then remembered. She'd been watching from a distance, waiting for the child she'd surrendered to grow into something worth reclaiming. I wasn't a lost daughter to her. I was a deferred investment. The only remaining question was who'd been sending her the quarterly reports, because the newspaper article carried my name, not my parents' unlisted number, and Renata had walked straight to the softest door in my life like someone had handed her a map. Theo and I argued that night, if you can call it arguing when two exhausted people who love each other simply disagree about the right way to be good. He wanted lawyers, a formal cease and desist, something cold and permanent. I understood the logic, but I kept circling back to the same soft, dangerous place, and I could hear exactly how it sounded even as the words left my mouth. If I help her just once, at least I'm the one who tried. At least I'm not the one who slammed the door. He studied me for a long moment. Elena, he said, you've already written the check in your head, haven't you? I hadn't, but I'd already uncapped the pen. That was the part one couldn't explain to him, because it lived underneath language entirely. When you're given away as a child for not being enough, you spend the rest of your life auditioning for a role you already lost. You overwork. You overgive. You stay late finishing wedding cakes. You keep everyone fed so nobody ever has a reason to hand you back. And here was Renata, offering me the exact audition I'd secretly wanted my whole life, proof that I was generous, forgiving, better than the people who discarded me. All it would cost was $45,000 and whatever dignity I had left. I actually picked the pen back up. Theo didn't stop me. He just said quietly, whatever you decide, decide it because it's yours, not because it's a bill she thinks you owe. I set the pen down. I didn't finish the check that night, but I didn't destroy the thought either. And somehow, 3 hours away, Renata seemed to sense it, because 2 days later, the second envelope arrived. Same cream paper. This time, a photograph tucked inside, a 19-year-old boy standing in front of a brick building, hands in his pockets, half a smile, the kind people wear when someone off-camera told them to smile. Julian. My half-brother. The word felt foreign in my chest, because I'd never had a sibling, and here was a stranger wearing my birth mother's exact jawline. Renata's note this time was shorter and sharper. She wrote that Julian had no idea she was reaching out, that he was too proud to ask for help himself, that he was the family's hope, the one who could finally make something of the name. Didn't I want to be part of that? He needs you, she'd written. Your brother needs you. She'd learned that appeals for herself bounced right off me, so she'd swapped weapons and put a boy in front of the money, the way people who understand leverage know exactly where the soft spots are. She knew I wouldn't fire back through a child. And it worked a little. I stared at that practiced half-smile for longer than I want to admit. But I've piped enough wedding cakes to know the difference between genuine joy and a smile assembled for a camera on the count of 3. Julian's was the second kind. So I flipped the photo over, a baker's habit, you always check underneath, and found in different handwriting, a return address. Not Renata's city 3 hours away. A house 1 county over from mine. My birth mother's cousin. My aunt, Delphine. I'd met Delphine exactly twice, both by accident, both facilitated by Margaret, who'd kept one thin thread of contact with that side of the family the way you keep a spare key you hope never to need. Delphine had always struck me as neutral, the aunt who mailed holiday cards and asked no invasive questions, the demilitarized zone between two warring countries. And her handwriting was sitting on the back of a photograph my birth mother had mailed specifically to breach my boundaries. I laid both envelopes side by side on my table and felt something inside me shift gears entirely. Up until that point, I'd only been reacting, blocking numbers, warning Margaret, arguing with Theo, playing defense against a threat 3 hours away. But defense loses slowly, and I had a son now, and I was finished losing slowly. If Renata had a working map of my life, I wanted to know exactly who had drawn it. So I made a decision that felt, at the time, like inhaling before diving underwater. I would stop guessing and start confirming. I'd call Delphine, not to accuse, just to listen. Because people who assume you know nothing tend to tell you everything. I dialed before I could talk myself into something gentler. Delphine answered on the second ring, warm as always. "Oh honey, it's been ages. How's that gorgeous baby?" I asked, gently, whether she'd heard from Renata recently. A pause followed, small, but noticeable. The kind of pause that happens when the honest answer and the safe answer are wrestling in someone's throat. Then she said, "Well, you know how she worries about you." I sent her little updates, just so she stops fretting. She said it like an act of kindness. She had no idea she'd just handed me the map, and she genuinely believed she was doing me a favor. I kept my tone soft, because a soft voice is a fishing line, and I wanted the entire story. "Updates," I repeated. "What kind of updates?" And Delphine, relieved to finally be talking about something, let it all spill out. For years, since I was a teenager, really, Renata would call and ask how I was doing, and Delphine would relay whatever Margaret had shared. When I got into my baking program. When Theo and I married. When the shop opened. When Milo was born. "She just wanted to know you were happy," Delphine said, as though that made it harmless. I listened to a grown woman describe, in the tone of someone recounting a good deed, how she'd spent over a decade acting as a private pipeline feeding my personal milestones to the exact person I'd been protected from. Every achievement I'd earned had been quietly reported back like weather updates. "She's your mother, Elena," Delphine said when I stayed silent too long. "Blood is blood." And there it was, the entire machine, condensed into one tidy phrase, delivered by a woman who genuinely believed she was the reasonable one. She wasn't cruel. That was almost the hardest part. She simply believed family was a debt that automatically outranked any boundary a daughter might try to draw. I thanked her. I didn't raise my voice, because yelling only convinces people you're the unreasonable one. Instead, as evenly as I could manage, I asked her to stop sending Renata any information about me or my son ever again. Silence followed, hurt, confused, the silence of someone who genuinely cannot fathom why you'd refuse a kindness. "Oh," she said eventually. "Well, if that's what you want. But honey," her voice dropped, gentle and devastating, "you can't really stop your mother once she's decided something." Cutting Delphine loose cost more than I'd expected, and I want to be honest about that too. She wasn't a villain. She was the last thin thread connecting me to a whole branch of my history I'd never gotten to explore. The aunt who might have told me stories about grandparents, about where certain features in my face actually came from, about whether anyone else in that bloodline also woke before sunrise to knead dough. When I asked her to stop, I felt that thread finally snap, and I stood in my kitchen holding a disconnected phone, a little more alone than I'd been that morning. Nobody warns you about this part of protecting yourself. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like subtraction. Every wall you build to keep the dangerous people out inevitably blocks a few of the maybe good ones standing just behind them, and you rarely get the luxury of sorting the crowd first. I lost an aunt that afternoon and gained a locked front door. On paper, a fair trade. In my chest, it simply ached. Theo found me still standing there and didn't ask what happened. He just started cooking, because he's learned that sometimes the kindest response is filling a room with the smell of dinner and letting a person find their own way back. Over the stove, he said only one thing. "She warned you, right? That Renata's already decided." I nodded. "Then decide back," he said, not louder, just first. Good advice. I would spend the next several weeks failing to follow it, because Renata, having lost her information pipeline, didn't slow down at all. She simply stopped writing and started driving. I visited Margaret and Walt the following Sunday at the small blue house 4 blocks from the bakery to do the thing I'd been dreading, deliberately frightening my elderly parents for their own protection. I sat them down at the same table where I'd learned to crack eggs with one hand and told them everything. The letters, the demanded money, Delphine, all of it. I warned them that Renata might show up at their door and that under no circumstances should they let her inside, not even for a moment, not even to be polite. Walt went quiet and stern, the specific expression he gets when something mechanical breaks and he's already solving it in his head. But Margaret went pale in a way I didn't like, one hand drifting to her chest, and she asked, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "Elena, honey, is this going to be all right?" I hated Renata more in that single moment than I had through every letter combined, because I was watching a woman with a fragile heart absorb fear she hadn't earned, forcing herself to look brave even as her color drained. I brought her water. I stayed too long. And only later did I notice that Margaret had gone strangely quiet when I mentioned Renata might call the house again. She hadn't called her that terrible woman, the way I'd expected. She just looked down at her hands. At the time I assumed it was fear. I should have asked what she wasn't saying. Instead I let it go, telling myself she was simply tired and I'd frightened her enough for one afternoon. The bakery saved me that week, the way physical work always does. There's no room for a spiraling mind when 4 dozen loaves need to come out by 4 o'clock. Walt came by to help, because he genuinely can't stay away from an oven, and we worked the morning shift side by side the way we had when I was 17, and he was teaching me that patience is just love wearing a kitchen timer. Around mid-morning mid-lull, he wiped flour off his hands and said something I've kept folded in my apron pocket ever since. "You know why we kept you," he said, not looking up from the dough. "Wasn't because you were easy. Lord knows you weren't. Wasn't because we knew you'd amount to anything either. We didn't know that yet." He turned the dough over slowly. "You don't get kept for being useful, Elena. You get kept for being ours." I had to step into the back for a minute. I ran the tap and told myself it was flour dust in my eyes, because that sentence went straight into the wound Renata had reopened, the one insisting that love was a bill I was perpetually behind on, that I had to earn my place at every single table I ever sat at. Walt had just handed me the opposite equation offhandedly, like it was obvious. You get kept for being ours. I didn't yet understand how badly I'd need that sentence. I just knew it belonged to me now, the way the bakery did, quietly, for the price of almost nothing. She arrived on a Thursday. I know because Thursday is my slow day, and slowness is what let me actually notice her. I was frosting a tray of lemon tarts near the front window when an unfamiliar sedan parked across the street, the kind of car people buy specifically to look established. A woman stepped out, late 50s, wearing a coat too formal for our little downtown, and she stood on the far sidewalk staring at my shop the way you'd stare at a house you used to live in. I recognized her before I consciously recognized her, the way you spot your own jawline on a total stranger. Renata. She'd driven nearly 200 miles to stand across the street and study the building I'd built with my own hands. She didn't come inside. That was the detail that iced my spine. She simply looked, for one long minute, at the gold lettering spelling out marigolds on the glass, and at me behind the counter holding a piping bag, and something crossed her face I couldn't read and didn't want to. Then she got back in her car and drove away. I stood frozen, tart half-frosted, but she hadn't driven that far for nothing. An hour later, Margaret called, her voice trembling, to tell me a woman had left an envelope in her mailbox, cream-colored, addressed not to Margaret, but to Lila. Renata had traveled 200 miles, looked at the daughter she'd surrendered, decided against speaking to her directly, and instead delivered her demand straight to the one door I couldn't afford to leave unguarded. She wasn't going to ask me anymore. She was going to route around me entirely. I caught up with her before she reached the highway, because our town only has one road leading out past the old feed store. I pulled alongside her sedan at a red light and rolled my window down, and for the first time in 29 years, I looked my birth mother directly in the eye. Up close she looked softer than her coat suggested, tired around the mouth. When she recognized me, her whole expression rearranged itself into something warm and rehearsed. "Lila," she breathed like an answered prayer. "My name is Elena," I said. "And you need to stop going to my parents' house." She flinched slightly at the word parents, A card player caught mid-bluff. Then she recovered and did the thing I'd only witnessed on paper until now, softening her voice while embedding a hook in every sentence. "I only ever wanted what's best for this family," she said. "I gave you a better life than I could offer. All I'm asking is that you help your brother, the same way I made sure you'd be helped. I gave you up so you could rise. Don't you think you owe this family that chance?" The light turned green. Someone honked behind us. And in that single breath, at a stoplight in my own town, Renata had recited the entire philosophy of her life out loud, calm as scripture, reframing abandonment as generosity, transforming the act of discarding me into an investment she was now collecting on. In her mind, I owed her simply for the act of being given away. I didn't argue. I just said, "That's not how any of this works," and rolled my window shut. But as I pulled away, her final words reached me through the glass, about my son. She'd called Milo her grandchild. "That's my grandbaby too," she'd said, right before the window sealed her off completely. Those words followed me home like a smell that won't wash out. It shouldn't have rattled me. Just biology, a technicality, the same technicality that let her sign a letter, your mother. But it did rattle me, because it revealed the true scale of what she wanted. She didn't want $45,000. That was only the opening bid. She wanted permanent access, a standing claim on my life, my parents, my son, a seat at a table I'd built specifically, so people like her could never occupy it. That night I sat on the nursery floor while Milo slept, finally letting myself feel exhausted, the very specific fatigue of holding a door shut against someone stronger than the lock. Theo sat beside me, too large for the small space, and didn't offer any clever advice. He just repeated, "We're okay," until I could breathe normally again. And in that quiet, the old temptation resurfaced, reasonable and seductive. Just pay her the $45,000 and be done with it. You can afford it. Be the bigger person. I was worn down enough that I nearly agreed, just to make it stop. Then my phone lit up on the nursery floor. The bakery's after-hours line. Nobody calls that at night. My stomach knew before I even answered. It was Walt. His voice was wrong. "Elena," he said, "your mother's in the hospital." I don't remember the drive there, only the parking lot, only running. Margaret was in a bed with wires taped to her chest and an oxygen line under her nose, smaller than I was prepared to accept. Walt sat in the corner chair looking a decade older than he had that morning. The doctor called it a mild cardiac event, caught early, manageable with rest and reduced stress, and he said reduced stress while reading a chart, unaware he'd just prescribed the one thing my family could no longer guarantee. Because when I finally got Walt alone in the hallway, he told me what had happened, and something in me went cold and very still. Renata had come to the house that afternoon, after the mailbox delivery. She'd knocked, and Margaret, who I'd warned 100 times never to open that door, had opened it anyway, because Margaret is polite, and because Renata had stood on the porch and said the one thing capable of slipping past every defense. "You've had her for 30 years. I only want a little help for my son. You owe me the daughter you got to keep." She'd accused a woman with a failing heart of theft. And Margaret, who had never once made me feel like anything other than chosen, absorbed that accusation standing in her own doorway until her chest seized and Walt found her gripping the kitchen counter. I sat by Margaret's bed the entire night. Near dawn she woke, found my hand, and whispered something I'll carry for the rest of my life. "Don't let her take you from me," she said, as though I were the one in danger of being stolen. In the gray morning light, she asked me to bring her the mail from home. Ordinary mail, bills and flyers, because ordinary things are what frightened people reach for. Walt had grabbed it in his rush out the door, still tucked in his coat pocket, and when he handed it over, there in the middle of an electric bill and a grocery circular sat the cream envelope, Renata's mailbox delivery, addressed to Lila. It had ridden along by accident, and now it rested on my adoptive mother's lap in a hospital gown, her trembling hand resting on top of it, shaking not from the letter itself, just from being 72 and exhausted and hooked to a monitor. I looked at that image, Margaret's shaking hand resting over Renata's demand for money, in a hospital room at dawn, and something inside me that had been slowly shifting all week finally finished changing. Up until that envelope, I'd been fighting to preserve some fragile peace, hoping there was a version where nobody had to be the villain, where I could pay a fee and everything would go quiet. That fantasy died on the blanket in front of me, because I finally understood exactly what I was up against. Renata would never come at me directly again. She'd learned I was too solid for that. She would always aim sideways at Margaret, at Walt, at Milo eventually, because that was the only leverage that had ever worked on someone like me, someone who'd built her entire identity around protecting others. I took the envelope off my mother's lap so she wouldn't have to hold it another second. And I made a decision that felt like stepping off a ledge. I was going to drive the 200 miles to Renata City myself. Not to pay. To find out what that money was actually for. Because whatever it was, I was fairly certain it had nothing to do with tuition. And I was done letting her write the story from a safe distance. When she went after the woman who actually raised me, something in me went permanently quiet and cold. If you've ever felt strangely calm in the exact moment you should have fallen apart, you already know what's coming. I waited until Margaret was stable and home. 3 days later, I made the drive. Theo offered to come with me. I asked him to stay and guard the house instead, because I needed that more than I needed company, and because some things you have to walk into on your own 2 feet. 200 miles is a lot of highway, and a lot of time to talk yourself out of something. I didn't. I let the countryside blur past. Fields, then strip malls, then the gray edges of her city, and I rehearsed nothing, because I'd learned that rehearsed people sound like liars, and I wanted to sound like the truth. I had one question, and it was simple. What is the money actually for? Not what she'd written, what it truly funded. 45,000 is a specific number, not a vague wish. Specific numbers come from actual bills, and I wanted to see them. Her neighborhood was tidy and worn thin, small houses, oversized trucks, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. I found the address from her letter and parked across the street, mirroring the exact way she'd once parked across from my shop, and for a second I understood the impulse, the pull to look before you knock. Then I stepped out, and before I could reach the door, it opened. A teenager came down the steps hauling a duffel bag, tall and uncertain, with a jawline I'd recognize anywhere, because I see it in my own mirror every morning. He stopped when he saw me. We stood there, 2 strangers sharing a face, on a cracked front walk in a city 3 hours from my entire life. Julian. He had no idea who I was. I could see it plainly. He studied me with the polite confusion of a well-raised kid encountering an unfamiliar woman. "Can I help you, ma'am?" And that ma'am nearly broke something in me, because he was my brother, and he was calling me ma'am. "My name is Elena," I said. I watched it register as nothing. I think Renata is my mother too. I watched the color leave his young face in real time. He set the duffel down slowly. He couldn't finish. "I had a sister," he said finally, more to himself than to me, testing the fact like it might dissolve. "Mom mentioned it once when I was little. Said there'd been a baby before me. A girl. Said it just didn't work out. Didn't work out." That was the phrase Renata had given him for handing me to strangers, like a failed recipe, like a cancelled contract, like something you attempt and then discard. I didn't correct him standing there on the sidewalk. This boy hadn't discarded me. He'd been unborn when that choice was made, and I could already tell he was more casualty than culprit. But I'd driven 200 miles for understanding, so I asked, gently, whether he was excited about college. He looked at me like I'd switched languages mid-sentence. "College? What college?" And the entire cream-colored narrative Renata had constructed around $45,000 cracked straight down the middle, because the boy the money was supposedly funding had just told me he'd never even heard of the plan. We stood on that sidewalk while I asked careful questions, the kind you ask when you're afraid the truth might be worse than you hoped. No, he wasn't enrolled anywhere. No, nobody had ever discussed tuition with him. He'd finished high school in the spring and wanted to pursue a welding apprenticeship. He was good with his hands, always had been. But his mother insisted on a real school, and he hadn't wanted to fight her on it, so mostly he'd just been working at a garage and hoping the pressure would fade. He had absolutely no idea a woman 3 hours away was being asked for $45,000 in his name. When I told him, carefully, that his mother had written asking exactly that for his education, his expression did something complicated. Not entirely surprised, but ashamed. The specific shame of a kid who's spent his whole life being spent like currency, watching it happen again in real time in front of a stranger who shares his chin. "Mom does that," he said, barely audible. "Tells people things about me." His voice caught, and he looked down at the duffel bag by his feet, the one he'd been carrying out the door when I arrived. And I understood I'd walked directly into the middle of a boy leaving home. Two siblings, one discarded, one over-leveraged, standing on opposite ends of an identical scale. I asked him what he actually wanted, and he told me. The welding certification program at a technical college 2 towns over, 9 months, hands-on, an actual trade, an actual paycheck at the end. He'd worked out the cost himself and had already saved part of it from the garage. A small, honest number for a small, honest dream. But whenever he brought it up, his mother would get that look, he said, disappointed, like he was choosing to be less than the family required, and she'd start talking about the sister who'd thrown away her chances, meaning me, meaning a cautionary tale I'd become without ever setting foot in the room. "So I'm the warning," I said, and he winced. "Yeah. Sorry." I told him not to apologize. I looked at this kid across from me and finally saw the entire mechanism clearly, the one Delphine had named without understanding it. Renata had 2 children. She'd discarded one for being a girl, and was now slowly crushing the other for being the boy she'd staked her whole future on. Different weapons, identical scale. I'd spent my life believing I was the family's failure. Standing on that sidewalk, I realized that wasn't the shape of it at all. The truth was uglier and cleaner simultaneously. Renata hadn't rejected me for lacking value. She'd simply been blind to value that didn't fit her plan. She'd thrown away a daughter and shackled a son using the exact same rule, the same brutal arithmetic that says a child's worth is measured by what they can do for the family name. I wasn't the failed one, and Julian wasn't the favored one. We were both just entries in a ledger that had never actually been about either of us. The front door creaked, and Renata stepped out onto the porch, saw the 2 of us standing together, and her face collapsed for one unguarded second, pure panic, the look of a woman whose 2 separate performances had just met each other in her own front yard. Then the mask slid back into place, warm and quick. "Julian, honey," she called, "go put your bag back inside and let me talk with our guest." Not Lila. Not Elena. Our guest, stripping me of even a name in front of him. Julian looked at me, then at her, picked up his duffel, and went inside, obedient in a way I never learned to be. I felt something close to envy curdle instantly into grief, because his obedience was a cage, and mine had been exile, and neither of us had ever simply gotten to be a child. Renata came down the steps and took my elbow like we were old friends, guiding me toward the door, chattering about coffee, about how far I'd traveled, about how I should have called ahead. I let her steer me inside, because I wanted to see the paperwork, wanted to stand in the room where $45,000 supposedly had a legitimate reason to exist. She sat me at her kitchen table, all hospitality, and turned to fill a kettle. While her back was turned, my eyes did what a baker's eyes always do. Swept the surfaces, the counters, the papers shoved to the edge of the table where people hide things they don't want a guest to see. A stack sat there, envelopes with plastic address windows, the kind of mail that always means somebody owes somebody. The top one, readable from where I sat, wasn't a tuition invoice. Renata stepped out to take a call, performing reluctance the entire time. "So sorry. Just a minute, family business." The moment the screen door clapped shut, Julian slipped back into the kitchen, clearly having waited for the gap. He sat across from me, this boy with my exact chin, and spoke fast and low, the way you talk when a door might swing open any second. He wanted to tell me the truth, he said, because nobody had ever asked him for it. He didn't want college. He'd said so a dozen different ways, and she'd never once heard him. What he wanted was the welding program, and he had the brochure hidden in his room, and he'd calculated the real cost himself, a fraction of $45,000. "So I'm the excuse," I said, and he nodded, miserable. I looked at this kid and finally saw the whole machine with total clarity. We didn't have much time, and we both knew it, so we did in 9 minutes what should have taken 9 years. He told me he'd always felt watched but never truly seen. I told him I'd always felt seen but never actually wanted. He laughed, short and surprised. "Guess we got opposite halves of the same bad deal." "Yeah," I said. "We did." He asked, hesitant, what I was going to do about the money. "Quick, before she comes back," I asked where she kept the bills. He pointed at the stack by my elbow, the one I'd already spotted. Look at the top one, he whispered. It's not for me. I looked. 10 seconds is plenty of time when you already know what you're searching for. It wasn't a tuition statement. It was a past due notice, the amount circled in the same neat, looping hand that had written "My darling Lila." Underneath it, more of the same, a second notice on a personal loan under Renata and her husband Curtis's names, a collections letter, and at the very bottom of the pile, something that snapped the whole picture into focus. A cousin's wedding from months earlier, and a note about gift money Renata had promised the extended family and never actually paid. A debt of appearances as much as cash. I sat back just as the screen door announced her return, but by then I understood everything. The $45,000 had never been for Julian's education. It was Renata's own debt, her own defaulted loans, and threaded through all of it, the money she'd promised the family to preserve her reputation and simply couldn't cover. She hadn't come to me for her son's future. She'd come for her own standing, wrapped in a boy's name specifically because she knew I'd never fire back through a child. Julian was the shield. The debt was the actual wound. And I was the deep pocket she'd been patiently letting ripen for 20 years, ever since she looked at a 3-year-old and calculated which child would cost less to keep. Renata swept back in, kettle finally screaming behind her, and asked brightly, "So, have you thought about how you'd like to send it?" Here's the part one have to tell you carefully, because it's the moment the ground actually gave out beneath me. Right up until she asked that question, I'd been quietly holding a compromise in the back of my mind, a plan that felt almost noble. I'd stop calling the money hers. I'd send the $45,000 and tell myself it was purely for Julian, a gift laundered clean of Renata's fingerprints through sheer intention. I could rise above the whole situation, help the kid, be the generous one, and go home to my son feeling like the good person I'd spent my whole life auditioning to become. That plan survived the hospital and the 200-mile drive and the sidewalk conversation. It died at that kitchen table, 6 inches from my hand, because I finally understood there was no clean version of giving her money. There was no version of $45,000 that actually reached Julian. Every dollar would funnel straight into the past due notice, the collections letter, the wedding debt, the reputation Renata was drowning to maintain, the exact machine that had discarded me and was now slowly crushing my brother. If I paid, I wouldn't be rising above the family's twisted ledger. I'd be balancing its books. I'd be teaching Renata that the daughter she threw away was, in the end, worth exactly what she'd bet on, a return on investment, cashing out precisely on schedule. And I'd be teaching Julian that the one person who might have finally seen him had shown up and funded his cage instead. The imaginary check tore itself apart in my mind. I felt it happen, and it terrified me, because that check had been my entire strategy for 2 straight weeks. The escape hatch, the way to make everything stop, and it turned out to be a door that only opened deeper into her house. "So," Renata said again, patient, warm, poisonous. "How would you like to send it, dear?" I looked at her over the shrieking kettle and said, "I need to think." I stood up to leave, because I'd just realized that handing her anything, in any form, attached to any story, would make me complicit in the exact thing that had broken me. There was no paying my way out of this. There was only cutting the wire completely. Renata didn't "I need to think." Her face slipped, just briefly, the warmth curdling into something older and harder. And in that unguarded second, she finally told me something true, the only genuinely useful thing she ever gave me. "You think about everything, don't you?" she said. "Always so careful." Then quieter, almost to herself, "You owe me. I carried you. I gave you to people who could do better because I loved you enough to lose you. Do you understand what that costs a mother? The least you can do is not let this family drown." I stood by her door with my keys in hand, studying this woman who had just described abandoning her own child as an act of love so profound it had accrued interest for 30 years. She believed it completely. That was the detail that finally cooled every bit of heat out of me. She wasn't lying to manipulate me, not exactly. She'd repeated this story to herself so many times it had calcified into her actual bones. In her internal ledger, giving me up had been sacrifice, and sacrifice generates debt, and that debt belonged to me, because I was the one who'd received the better life she'd generously arranged. There was no arguing with it, because it wasn't an argument. It was a religion. And then she said the thing that revealed exactly how far she'd already gone. "I told the family you'd help," she said. "At the reunion, I told everyone my daughter did well and she'd take care of things. So you see, you have to, because if you don't, well, everyone will know exactly what kind of person you turned out to be." She'd spent my name before ever asking permission. And now she intended to collect the debt publicly. The family dinner was that Sunday, she informed me, as though I'd already agreed to attend. A reunion, she called it. The entire extended family gathered at her house. Aunts, cousins, Delphine, Curtis, and the wedding relatives she owed, all assembled to eat. And though she didn't phrase it this way, to witness. She was building a room. That's what I finally understood, standing at her door with the kettle finally silent behind us. A private no, she could survive. But a daughter who publicly rejected her mother in front of the entire family, who let the family drown when she could have prevented it, that daughter would be branded, and the shame would do the collecting her letters couldn't manage alone. It was elegant, in a horrifying way. She'd learned I wouldn't fold under guilt, so she was constructing a courtroom where the jury consisted of everyone whose opinion she'd trained me, from a careful distance through Delphine, to secretly still care about. "You'll come," she said. Not a question. Then the line that snapped the whole trap shut, delivered soft, almost tender. "Because if you don't come, I'll simply have to tell them my version, how the daughter I sacrificed everything for grew up cold and turned her back on the family that gave her every chance." She smiled. "And you're a businesswoman now. You know exactly what a reputation is worth." I drove home through 200 miles of darkness and didn't fall apart, though there was absolutely a version of that night where I could have. Instead, something in me went very clear and very level, the way a kitchen feels at 4 in the morning, before anyone else is awake. She'd built herself a room. Fine. I would decide exactly what happened inside it. I got home near midnight. Theo was still awake, of course, sitting at the kitchen table with the light on like a lighthouse, Milo asleep upstairs, Margaret's condition stable. He told me that first, knowing it was the sentence I needed before any other. Then he studied my face and said, "You're going to go to that reunion, aren't you?" I said yes. He didn't love it. "You don't have to walk into a room she built specifically to trap you," he said. "You don't owe her an appearance any more than you owe her money." He was right about her. But somewhere on that dark highway, I'd stopped making this entirely about her. "I'm not going for Renata," I told him. "I'm going for Julian." Because there was a boy in that house with a welding brochure hidden in his room, and a mother slowly converting him into a bill, and I was the only person alive who understood both ends of his particular trap, having survived the opposite one myself. If I stayed home and mailed a cold legal letter, I'd protect myself and abandon him in there completely alone. One more sibling I let the family sacrifice. I couldn't do that and still recognize the person in the mirror. But I also wasn't going to walk into her courtroom simply to be judged. I was going to walk in with an actual plan, built cold at my own kitchen table, with the two people I trusted most in the world. So the next morning, before the ovens had even warmed, I called Odette and then someone else and started building the only thing capable of beating a woman who saw children as currency, a way to give without her ever getting to spend a cent of it. Odette connected me with an estate attorney who specialized in education trusts, the kind of careful, unglamorous legal instrument nobody thinks about until it saves their life. I sat in her small office and explained exactly what I wanted, watching her expression shift from routine to genuinely interested as she understood the shape of the problem. I wanted to set aside real money for Julian, enough to fully fund the welding program and then some, enough to actually launch a life, but locked. Held by an independent third party, released only against verified educational or vocational expenses. Not payable to a parent. Not divertible toward any debt. Not a resource Renata could borrow against or pressure him into surrendering. It could only ever become the exact thing it was designed for. The attorney nodded slowly and confirmed it was entirely doable. She'd draft the full trust documentation, appoint an independent trustee, and structure the terms so funds released only against verified invoices, paid directly to the school or the tool supplier, never as cash into anyone's hands. Then she added the one condition that mattered most. For it to work cleanly, the beneficiary had to want it, had to agree knowingly, And it would be best if Renata didn't learn about the mechanism until it was already locked in place, because a person like the one I was describing would spend every available day hunting for a crack. I understood completely. My weapon wasn't going to be louder than hers, or crueler, or more manipulative. I wasn't going to expose her or shame her publicly, or prove I was the real victim. I was going to do the one thing her entire worldview had absolutely no defense against: give my brother something she could never convert into money. Something that helped him and, by design, could never help her. I left that office with a folder of paperwork, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the specific calm of someone who had stopped bracing and started actually building. Reaching Julian without Renata finding out took some care. He'd slipped me his number on that sidewalk, folded small like contraband, and I texted him from the shop one afternoon asking if he could talk somewhere his mother wasn't around. He called from the garage on his break, engine noise humming behind him, and I told him the truth plainly, the way Margaret had once told me the truth, because I've learned it's the only kind of respect that actually holds up over time. I told him the money his mother wanted was for her own debts, not his future, and I listened, even through a bad connection, to how that news simultaneously wounded and freed him, confirmation of something he'd half known his whole life. Then I told him my actual plan. Money set aside just for him, locked so nobody else could touch it, released only for the trade he genuinely wanted. He went quiet for a long stretch, engine noise filling the silence. Then, in a voice younger than 19, he said the thing that told me I was doing exactly the right thing, no matter what it cost. "Nobody's ever asked me what I wanted before," he said. "You're the first person who actually asked." I had to lean against the walk-in cooler door to stay upright, because he'd just described my entire life from the opposite angle. 2 kids, one thrown out, one held too tightly, and neither of us had ever once been asked. I told him I'd see him Sunday. I told him to say nothing to Renata. And I told him, because someone should have told both of us decades earlier, that what he wanted actually mattered, that it had always mattered, that wanting things was allowed. The night before the reunion, I stopped by the little blue house. Margaret was up and moving, slower than usual but unmistakably herself, banished from the kitchen by Walt and resenting every second of it. She made me sit while she fussed over whether I was eating enough. I told her where I was headed the next day, braced for renewed fear. Instead, my mother surprised me. She took my hand across the table, the same table, and instead of telling me to be careful, she told me something else entirely. "You spent your whole life, honey, thinking you had to earn your place here," she said. "Staying late, fixing everything, feeding everyone." She squeezed my hand. "But you didn't earn us. Nobody earns family. You don't get kept for being useful, Elena. You get kept for being ours." Walt's exact sentence in Margaret's voice, handed to me a second time, as if the two of them had quietly agreed I'd need to hear it twice. I understood, in that moment, that they had spent 20 years gently teaching me the precise opposite of everything Renata had taught me as a child. I asked Margaret how she knew I needed to hear it right then. She smiled, tired and wise. "Because tomorrow that woman is going to tell you your worth is whatever you can pay," she said. "And I need you to already know she's wrong before you ever walk through that door." I drove home with that sentence lodged in my chest like a stone I could actually hold on to. Whatever Renata had constructed in that house, whatever audience, whatever trap, I would walk in already armed with the one truth that made all of it powerless. Sunday, I drove the 200 miles one final time in my good coat, a cream envelope in my bag. Not a check, something else entirely. I'd chosen the color deliberately, the exact shade Renata favored, the exact shade of wedding icing, because I wanted her to see it and assume she'd won, right up until the second she opened it. Petty, maybe. But I felt entitled to one small indulgence after 29 years, and this one carried a point. The house was packed when I arrived. Cars lining both sides of the block, windows glowing warm and yellow. I sat outside for a minute, apparently a habit we both shared, breathing slowly, touching the envelope in my bag once like a talisman. Inside were the finalized trust documents, already signed by me, needing only Julian's agreement to lock them permanently. My weapon was a legal instrument boring enough to put an entire room to sleep, but it was the only weapon that actually fit the crime, because it gave without letting her take, helped without letting her heal her own reputation off the top, and no manipulation on earth could reach past a document that simply, structurally, would not release funds to anyone but the boy she'd been using as bait. I stepped out of the car and walked up the same steps Julian had carried his duffel bag down 2 weeks earlier. When Renata opened the door, her face bloomed with triumph, because I had come. To her, arriving at all could only mean I'd folded. "Lila," she said, warm and pitched loud enough for the hallway to hear. "You made it. Come in. Everyone's dying to meet you." I stepped into a front room full of strangers who shared my blood, all turning to study the daughter who'd been given away and somehow grown up successful. I understood I'd walked willingly into the courtroom she'd built. What she didn't understand was that I'd arrived carrying my own verdict. Dinner was theater, and I was the guest of honor in a play I hadn't been given a script for. Renata seated me at the center of the long table, visible to everyone, and played the reunited mother magnificently, touching my arm, calling me Lila in front of the aunts, telling a cousin how proud she was, how well her girl had turned out, as if she'd raised me herself, as if she hadn't handed me off at 3 years old. I watched the small things, because the small things are always where the truth actually hides. When the food circulated, she served Julian first, before Curtis, before the elders, an old reflex worn smoother than habit. The favored son fed first, always. Nobody at that table found it strange. That was the detail that chilled me most, sitting there with my hands folded in my lap. Not one warm, ordinary relative asking about my bakery saw anything odd in a mother who discarded a daughter now beaming at her, or a son fed first out of muscle memory nobody questioned. To this room, this was simply how family worked. Renata wasn't a monster to them. She was Aunt Renata, who'd had it hard, whose girl went to a better home, whose boy was going to make something of himself. The entire brutal arithmetic of my life was, to everyone else at that table, just ordinary math. I ate 3 bites I didn't taste and answered polite questions about croissants waiting, because you don't overturn a table before dessert, and because Renata had built this evening specifically to corner me in front of witnesses. I intended to let her, right up until the moment I turned the room into something she'd never planned for. It was an elderly great-aunt who accidentally cracked the door on Renata's history, the way older women sometimes do once they've outlived their fear of consequences. She patted my hand and said, "You know, your mother had it rough too, dear, when she was young." Then, warming to the memory, she told the whole table how Renata had grown up the only girl among brothers, in a household where sons received schooling and daughters received chores. How Renata's own mother had told her plainly that a daughter's entire purpose was marrying well and producing sons, that a woman who couldn't deliver a boy was a field that simply wouldn't take seed. How Renata had 2 daughters first and the second, the great-aunt continued, unaware she was describing me. Well, times were hard, and a girl was a mouth, and a son was the future, and Renata did what she felt she had to. The table murmured sympathetically, and I sat very still, watching the entire ugly machine expose its own gears. Renata hadn't invented the rule that discarded me. She'd been raised inside it, told from childhood that her worth lived in the sons she could produce, and she'd swallowed that poison, so young it became the water she swam in. When she found herself with a daughter she couldn't justify and a chance at a son instead, she'd made the only choice her entire world had ever offered her. I understood her in that moment, more than I ever wanted to. She wasn't the architect of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. I even felt the traitorous pull of sympathy, the wish that I could somehow reach back through the years to the girl she'd once been. But understanding isn't absolution, and a victim who becomes an enforcer is still, undeniably, an enforcer. The boy at the end of the table was still being fed first while his actual future sat folded in a document inside my bag. Renata let the sympathy settle, then made her move, having waited all evening for a full, softened room. She stood, wine glass in hand, tapping it gently until the table hushed. She spoke about family, about sacrifice, about how blessed she felt having everyone gathered together. Then she turned to me, her voice thick with the practiced warmth of someone about to spend her daughter publicly. "As many of you know," she said, "my Lila was raised elsewhere, and she's done so well, and she has generously agreed to help this family in our time of need. Especially her brother." She squeezed Julian's shoulder. He went rigid as a fence post. "Isn't that right, dear?" she said to me in front of the aunts, the cousins, the wedding relatives she owed, the great aunt who just narrated my origin story as tragedy. She had built the entire evening toward this single moment, a room full of witnesses, a public assumption of my agreement, so that a refusal would land not as a boundary but as betrayal. Cold, wealthy Lila, turning her back on family. Every face at that table turned toward me, kind and expectant, waiting for the grateful daughter to confirm her mother's generosity. I felt the trap close exactly as designed, the shame of disappointing an entire room, engineered specifically to override the truth of one clear wrong. I'll admit it, it was a beautifully constructed piece of machinery. I set down my fork and stood. I reached into my bag for the cream envelope, and I watched Renata's expression flood with victory, because to her, a woman reaching for an envelope at that exact moment could only signal one thing. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned that the person who stays quiet in a loud room becomes the only thing anyone can actually hear. "Thank you," I said, meaning it as a closing statement, not an opening, the way you thank a jury before delivering the verdict. I said I wanted to be honest, since we were, after all, family. Then, level as a countertop, I told them the truth about the money. "Not Julian's education," I said. "There is no college. Julian never enrolled anywhere. He'd like to learn a trade, and no one in this house has ever actually asked him." I explained that the $45,000 was for overdue loans and collections, and I looked directly at the wedding relatives, and gift money that was promised and never paid. I laid it all out plainly, no heat behind it, just the facts a baker keeps track of, and I watched the warm room turn cold in stages, faces swiveling from me to Renata and back, the murmur draining out entirely. Renata's mask didn't slip so much as shatter outright. "You ungrateful," she started, voice climbing, "after everything I gave up for you." And there it was, the accusation she'd been saving all along, the one that had ruled my entire life. Ungrateful. The word that insists you owe something, that a gift was given and never repaid, that your very existence is a debt. 2 weeks earlier, that word would have flattened me completely. But I had a sentence living in my chest now, given to me twice, and I stood in that collapsing loud room in front of every witness she'd assembled to shame me, and I didn't flinch, because I already knew the one truth that rendered her entire religion powerless. She'd gathered a courtroom. I was about to hand it a verdict it couldn't spend. I opened the cream envelope in front of everyone, and I did not pull out a check. I set the trust papers on the table where the light could catch them and explained, in the plain, slow voice you use for something that actually matters, exactly what they were. "This is money set aside for Julian," I said. "Enough for the welding program he actually wants, and then some. Enough to start a real life. It's held by an independent trust, managed by someone outside this family, and it can only ever be released for his education, his tools, his training. Not debts. Not gifts. Not anyone's reputation." I looked directly at Renata. "It cannot be given to you," I said. "It cannot be borrowed against or spent on anything but him. Ever. It belongs only to him, and only for the future he chose." The room went dead silent. Julian stared at those papers like they were written in a language he'd been waiting his entire life to finally read. And Renata, who had constructed an entire evening specifically to corner me into writing her a check, understood, in real time, that I'd arrived with a gift she could never touch, built specifically to route around her completely, and that in front of her whole assembled family, I had just transformed her from collector into witness. She opened her mouth to argue. "I don't need you to sign anything," I said, before she could locate an angle. "Only Julian does. This was never yours to approve." I slid the papers gently down the length of the table, past the aunts and cousins and wedding relatives, to the boy at the far end who'd always been fed first and truly seen never. "It's yours, Julian," I said. "If you want it. Nobody else gets a vote." Renata stood so fast her chair toppled backward, and the mask was gone completely now. The warm reunited mother burned away to reveal what lived underneath. She was loud now, in the exact way she'd engineered the whole room to make me become, except it was her unraveling in front of the family, not me. "You can't do this," she said. "You can't just walk in here and, after everything, after what I gave up, I gave you a better life. I sacrificed my own child so you could have more. You owe this family. You owe me. And the entire table watched a mother stand in her own dining room and demand payment for the act of having given her daughter away. I answered the only way that could actually end it, not by matching her volume, but by finally telling her the truth I'd driven 360 miles round trip and 29 years to say. I stayed seated, hands still on the table, and said, "You didn't give me away, Renata. You gave me back. There's a difference, and I finally understand it." She said, "After everything I gave up for you," and I said, "You gave me up. That's the only thing you ever gave." The room didn't gasp. It went stiller. The specific stillness of people watching a wall they'd always leaned on turned out to be nothing but a curtain. Then I stood, because I'd said the thing that mattered, and I told her the part that genuinely cost me, because the truth is, I did lose something at that table, and I want you to know I felt every bit of it. "I will not give you $1, I said. "Not now, not ever. And this is the last time you'll see me." I looked around the table. "I have a family. You're not in it." Then, to everyone else, especially Julian, "Every child in this house deserves to know their worth was never actually the question." I didn't raise my voice through any of it. Renata's shaking, her tears, her cry of "ungrateful child," thrown at my back as I turned. Those did all the shaking for both of us. I had walked into her courtroom to be judged, and instead, quietly, I had dismissed the case entirely. Then Julian did the bravest thing I witnessed all night, braver than anything I'd managed, because I'd had 29 years and a chosen family and a paid-off building fortifying me, and he had none of that, only 19 years spent inside her house. He picked up the trust papers, chair scraping against the floor, and in the silence, he looked at his mother, then at me, and said, voice cracking but holding steady, "I want the welding program. That's what I've always wanted." He was trembling, but he held on to those papers. Then, quieter, to Renata, she asked me, "Mom, Elena asked me what I wanted. You never did." It was, I think, the first time anyone in that room had chosen me over her, and it was her own favored son doing the choosing, stepping deliberately off the scale she'd spent his whole life balancing him on. Renata looked at Julian like the floor beneath her had simply vanished, because losing me had cost her nothing she actually valued. She'd staked everything on the boy, and now the boy was standing, holding a folder, choosing his sister and his own small, honest dream over her entire ledger. That she had never planned for. I rested my hand on Julian's shoulder once, the same way Walt rests his on mine. Some of the ants were quietly crying. Delphine wouldn't meet my eyes. Curtis, silent all evening, stared at his plate with an expression I couldn't name and didn't have time to study. Julian and I stood together at the end of that long table, holding a piece of paper nobody could ever buy, and for the first time in either of our lives, the arithmetic of that house failed to add up in Renata's favor. I didn't stay to be forgiven or fought with. There was nothing left in that room for me, and everything I'd driven there to accomplish was already finished. I set my own empty cream envelope down on the table, its purpose fulfilled, and told Julian the trust attorney would call him within the week, and that he could reach me anytime, day or night, and that he had a family now too, if he wanted one 3 hours away, that smelled permanently like bread. Then I said goodbye, only to him, and walked out through a front room full of people who shared my blood but not my life, past the coats and the abandoned casserole dishes, out the door, down the same steps Julian had carried his duffel bag down, into the cold, clean evening air. I didn't look back at the house. I'd spent 29 years looking back at that house, wondering if a light had ever been left on for me. Now I knew there had never been a light, only a ledger, and I was finally, permanently, closing the book on it. My hands stayed steady on the steering wheel. The whole drive up, I'd braced for how badly it would hurt to be called ungrateful in front of a full room, to lose the fantasy family for good, to sever that last remaining thread. And it did hurt, a real, specific grief, the death of a hope I'd carried since I was 3 years old in a too-fast-buttoned coat. But underneath the grief sat something I hadn't felt in the presence of those people in my entire life, air. The specific, clean air of a door closed gently, and closed for good. I drove home. Theo had left the porch light on, and Milo was asleep, and the house smelled like the soup he makes whenever he's worried. I stood in my own doorway for a moment, just to feel the difference between this threshold and the one I'd walked out of. He didn't ask how it went. He looked at my face and already knew, the way he always does, and he simply held me in the kitchen for a long time while the soup went cold on the stove. Later, I told him everything. The Grey Tant's story, the trust, Julian standing up, the word ungrateful thrown at my back. Theo, who isn't a man given to speeches, said only, "So you did it." Gave the kid a whole life and gave her nothing at all. I said, "Yeah." And I learned I'm not the one who got thrown away. I'm just the one who got out. That's the thing I carried home from that table more than any sense of victory. Not that I'd won, because you can't win against an entire worldview. Renata drove back to her debt still believing exactly what she'd always believed. But I'd reached into that machine and pulled one person free and closed the door on the rest, and come home to the family that had kept me for no reason at all except that I was theirs. The weeks after that dinner slowly emptied out, the way late summer does, and by the time the leaves on my street started turning, I could finally breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs again. Julian started the welding program that fall. He texts me photos, sparks, steel, a grin that actually reaches his eyes now, no photographer counting to 3 in the background. He doesn't go through Renata anymore. He comes straight to me, brother to sister, the two ends of that old scale finally speaking to each other without her hand hovering over the balance. He visited the bakery once, 3 hours in his own car, and Walt taught him to shape a loaf, and the sight of the two of them dusted in flour together is a memory I keep tucked in the same pocket as Walt's sentence. Renata never wrote again. I hear, through the thinned-out grapevine, that she still tells her version to the family, that her ungrateful daughter turned cold and wealthy and abandoned them, and that some relatives still believe her. I've made peace with that. The machine that discarded me is still running somewhere. I didn't dismantle it. I just stopped feeding it, and I pulled my brother free of its gears, and I made absolutely certain the account she opened when I was 3 would stay closed forever. Some debts you simply don't pay. Some debts were never actually yours to begin with. Nearly a year has passed since that table, 1 full turn of the seasons. Milo is 2 now, and he stands on a stool beside me most mornings with flour dusted across his nose, patting dough with small, serious hands, completely unaware that he is the entire point of all of it. I used to believe they'd given me back like a sweater that simply didn't fit. But you can't actually return a person. I just hadn't learned that yet. 3 years old in a cold car, in a coat buttoned too fast. Milo will never learn that arithmetic. He'll grow up in a house where nobody gets fed first, where love is never a bill waiting to be collected, where he is kept every single day for absolutely no reason except that he belongs to us. That's the wall I ended up building. Not just the one keeping Renata out, though it does that too, but the one keeping Milo safely inside, unconditionally, long before he's ever asked to earn a single thing. He'll never have to audition for his seat at this table. He was born already holding it. And on the mornings he falls asleep curled in the flour bin, I look at him and understand, fully and finally, that I was always worth keeping. I just had to be the one who decided it. I spent my whole life trying to be useful enough to deserve staying. It turns out the people who actually love you never once run that math. A cream envelope. A borrowed name. A table full of people waiting for me to fold. I didn't. If you've ever had to decide that love should never cost you your entire self, if you've ever had a door you finally needed to close gently and leave closed, then this story was for you too. Tell me in the comments about the door you finally shut, and subscribe to Quiet Reckonings. I'll keep the light on and the ovens warm for you.